Lonely Lumberjack rescued an Apache girl shackled by her father. The sound that woke him was not the wind through the pines or the call of nocturnal creatures, but the soft clink of metal against stone. Thomas McKenna had lived alone in the mountains of Arizona Territory for 8 years, and he knew every sound the wilderness could make. This was different. This was human desperation wearing chains. What he discovered at dawn behind his cabin would force him to choose between the safety of his solitude and a young woman's freedom, a choice that would transform both their lives in ways neither could imagine. Thomas had built his life in deliberate isolation, carving out an existence in the remote Mogollon Rim country, where towering ponderosa pines created cathedral silence, and the nearest neighbor lived 40 miles away. At 38, he was a man shaped by loss and hardened by years of physical labor. The death of his wife and infant son during the difficult birth had driven him from civilization 8 years earlier, seeking a place where grief could heal slowly among trees that asked nothing of him but respect. His property consisted of 160 acres of pristine forest land, purchased from the territorial government with money earned during his years as a logger in the Pacific Northwest. The cabin he had built from hand-hewn logs stood in a natural clearing beside a year-round stream, surrounded by outbuildings that included a workshop, barn, and storage sheds. He made his living cutting and milling timber from his own land, selling lumber to the few settlements scattered throughout the territory. The work suited Thomas perfectly. It required skill and strength, but allowed him to maintain complete control over his environment and his interactions with other people. He went to town perhaps 4 times a year to sell his lumber and purchase supplies, spending the rest of his time in the company of trees that grew straight and true, unlike the complicated relationships that had brought him so much pain. His relationship with the local Apache bands had been carefully neutral. Thomas understood that he was living on land that had been tribal territory for countless generations, and he tried to show appropriate respect for that history. He never hunted more than he needed, never cut trees near sacred sites, and always left offerings of food or tools when he found evidence of tribal presence on his property. In return, the Apache had largely left him alone, recognizing him as a solitary man who posed no threat to their way of life. The sound that disturbed his sleep came just before dawn on a cold October morning. Thomas woke instantly, his years in the wilderness having trained him to respond immediately to any unusual noise. He lay motionless in his bed, listening carefully to determine whether the sound represented danger or merely some animal investigating his property. When the metallic clink came again, followed by what sounded like a muffled sob, Thomas knew he was dealing with a human presence. He dressed quickly and took his rifle from its place beside the door, though he hoped he would not need to use it. Moving as quietly as possible, he stepped onto the porch and began to circle his cabin, searching for the source of the disturbance. He found her behind the woodshed, huddled against the wall in a futile attempt to find shelter from the cold mountain air. She appeared to be about 18 years old, with long black hair that fell like a curtain around her face. Her traditional Apache dress was torn and dirty, and her feet were bare despite the near-freezing temperature. Most shocking were the iron shackles around her ankles, connected by a short chain that would make walking difficult and running impossible. The young woman looked up at Thomas with eyes that showed no fear, only a resigned exhaustion that suggested she had endured more suffering than anyone her age should have to bear. She spoke in Apache, her voice barely above a whisper, and though Thomas did not understand the words, her tone conveyed a mixture of defiance and desperation. "I will not hurt you," Thomas said softly, setting his rifle aside and raising his hands to show they were empty. "Do you speak English?" The girl nodded slowly. "Some English," she said, her accent heavy but her pronunciation clear. "What is your name?" "Ayana," she replied. "Eternal flower. That is a beautiful name. I am Thomas. Who did this to you?" Ayana looked down at the shackles around her ankles, and Thomas saw fresh tears begin to flow down her cheeks. "My father. He says I bring shame to our family." Thomas felt a cold anger beginning to build in his chest. He had seen many forms of cruelty during his years on the frontier, but the sight of a young woman chained like an animal struck him as particularly barbaric. "Why does he believe that?" "I will not marry the man he has chosen," Ayana said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Kuruk is twice my age and already has 2 wives. He treats women like possessions to be used and discarded. I told my father I would rather die than become Kuruk's third wife. Thomas understood immediately. Arranged marriages were common among many Apache bands, and a daughter's refusal to honor such arrangements could be seen as a serious challenge to paternal authority. But chaining a young woman like a criminal seemed far beyond any reasonable response to family disagreement. "How long have you been wearing those chains?" Thomas asked, kneeling down to examine the iron shackles more closely. 3 days, Ayana replied. "My father said I would wear them until I agreed to marry Kuruk, or until I died of stubbornness. Last night I managed to slip away from our camp, but I cannot go far with these chains. I was hoping to find someone who could help me remove them." Thomas studied the shackles with the practiced eye of someone who had worked with metal for many years. They were crudely made but effective, held closed by pins that had been hammered flat to prevent removal. Getting them off would require either the proper tools or considerable force that might injure the wearer. "I can remove them," Thomas said, "but it will take some time and care to avoid hurting you. Are you willing to trust me?" Ayana looked at him for a long moment, perhaps trying to read his intentions in his expression. Finally, she nodded. "You could have turned me away or delivered me back to my father for a reward. Instead, you offer to help. Yes, I will trust you." Thomas helped Ayana to her feet and supported her as they made their way to his workshop. Her feet were cut and swollen from walking in shackles over rough ground, and she moved with the careful gait of someone who had learned to compensate for restricted movement. Once inside the workshop, Thomas settled her on a wooden chair and began gathering the tools he would need. "This is going to be uncomfortable," Thomas warned, as he positioned a small chisel against one of the pins holding the shackles closed. "The metal is close to your skin, and I need to be very careful not to cut you." Ayana gripped the arms of the chair and nodded. "I am ready." The work was painstaking and delicate. Thomas had to use a small hammer and chisel to gradually work the flattened pins back through their holes, all while being careful not to let the tools slip and injure Ayana's legs. She bore the discomfort without complaint, though he could see her knuckles turning white as she gripped the chair. After nearly an hour of careful work, the first shackle fell away with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through the workshop like a bell of freedom. The skin beneath was raw and bloody where the iron had chafed against her ankle, but there appeared to be no serious injury. The second shackle proved more difficult, as the pin had been hammered more thoroughly, but eventually it too yielded to Thomas's patient efforts. When both shackles finally lay on the workshop floor, Ayana looked down at her freed legs with tears of relief streaming down her face. She flexed her ankles carefully, wincing at the pain, but clearly grateful to have full movement restored. "Thank you," she said simply. "You have given me back my freedom." "What will you do now?" Thomas asked as he cleaned and bandaged the cuts on her ankles. "Your father will look for you, and he will not be pleased to find that someone helped you escape." Ayana's expression grew troubled. "I do not know. I cannot return to my people while my father insists on this marriage. But I have nowhere else to go. I am Apache, but I am also alone." Thomas felt the familiar stirring of protective instincts that he had thought were buried with his wife and child. This young woman needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. But helping her would mean involving himself in tribal politics and family disputes that could have serious consequences for his peaceful existence. "You can stay here," Thomas heard himself saying. "At least until you decide what you want to do next." Ayana looked at him with surprise. "You would do this? Take in a stranger who brings trouble to your door?" "You are not trouble," Thomas replied. "You are a person who needs help, and I have lived alone for too long to turn away someone who has nowhere else to go." Over the following days, Thomas and Ayana began to develop a routine that accommodated both her need for safety and his desire to maintain some semblance of his normal life. She proved to be remarkably capable, helping with cooking and household tasks, while learning about the way Thomas lived in his isolated mountain sanctuary. Ayana was clearly intelligent and curious about everything around her. She asked thoughtful questions about Thomas's woodworking tools and techniques, and she shared her own knowledge about plants and animals that could be found in the surrounding forest. Her English improved rapidly through constant practice, and Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations by the fire each evening. "Why do you live alone?" Ayana asked one night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the clear mountain sky. Thomas had been dreading this question, but he found that Ayana's direct manner made it easier to answer than he had expected. I had a wife and son once. They died during childbirth 8 years ago. I came here because I could not bear to stay in the place where we had been happy together. You ran away from your grief, Ayana observed gently. Yes, Thomas admitted. I suppose I did. My people believe that grief is like a river, Ayana said. It will find its way to the ocean, whether you try to dam it up or let it flow freely. But if you try to stop it, it will only flood everything around it. The wisdom in her words struck Thomas deeply. He had indeed tried to dam up his grief, and the result had been 8 years of emotional isolation that had cut him off from all the joy that life might offer. Perhaps it was time to let the river flow. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to realize that his feelings for Ayana were evolving beyond simple compassion for someone in need. She brought warmth and life to his cabin in ways that had nothing to do with her help with daily tasks. Her presence filled the empty spaces in his heart that he had thought were permanently scarred by loss. But Thomas was also aware of the complications that such feelings represented. Ayana was Apache, young and beautiful, while he was a white man nearly 20 years her senior who had withdrawn from the world. Even if she could somehow return his growing affection, they would face enormous challenges from both their communities. The crisis came in late November, when Thomas returned from a trip to his lumber storage area to find armed Apache warriors surrounding his cabin. There were perhaps a dozen men, all mounted and carrying weapons, led by a tall figure whose bearing suggested leadership and authority. Thomas recognized him as someone he had seen during his occasional encounters with tribal members, though they had never spoken directly. Thomas McKenna, the leader called out in accented but clear English. I am Standing Bear, war chief of the White Mountain Band. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Thomas walked slowly toward the group, his hands visible and empty. I have a guest who asked for my protection. Nothing more. My daughter is not a guest, Standing Bear replied coldly. She is a disobedient child who has shamed her family and dishonored the agreements I have made for her future. At that moment, Ayana appeared in the doorway of the cabin. She walked out to stand beside Thomas, her chin held high despite the obvious fear in her eyes. Father, she said quietly, I will not marry Kuruk. I would rather die than become his property. Standing Bear's face hardened. Your desires are not important, daughter. You will honor the commitments I have made, or you will face the consequences of your defiance. What consequences? Thomas asked, stepping slightly in front of Ayana in a protective gesture. Chains? Imprisonment? Is that how Apache fathers treat their daughters? You do not understand our ways, white man, Standing Bear replied. A daughter's duty is to obey her father in all things, especially in matters of marriage and family honor. I understand that no parent has the right to force their child into a marriage they do not want, Thomas said firmly. That is not a matter of culture. That is a matter of basic human dignity. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas could see the other warriors shifting restlessly in their saddles, clearly prepared for violence if their chief commanded it. But he could also see something else in Standing Bear's eyes. The pain of a father whose love for his daughter was warring with his sense of duty and tradition. She is my daughter, Standing Bear said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. She belongs with her people. I belong with someone who respects my right to choose my own path, Ayana said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Thomas has shown me more kindness in these past weeks than I received in months of being chained like an animal. And what of your duty to your people? Standing Bear asked. What of the alliance with Kuruk's band that your marriage would secure? What of my duty to myself? Ayana countered. What of my right to seek happiness rather than simply serving the political needs of others? Thomas could see that the argument between father and daughter had deep roots that went far beyond the immediate marriage dispute. This was about changing times, conflicting values, and the struggle between tradition and individual freedom that was reshaping Apache society under the pressure of white settlement. There might be another way, Thomas said suddenly, an idea forming in his mind. What if Ayana were to marry someone else? Someone who could provide the same benefits to your people that Kuruk's alliance would offer? Standing Bear looked at him with suspicion. What do you mean? I mean myself, Thomas said, surprising everyone present, including Ayana. I own valuable land and timber rights. I have good relationships with territorial officials and trading contacts throughout the region. A marriage alliance with me could provide your people with benefits that equal or exceed what Kuruk offers. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Ayana gasped beside him, while Standing Bear studied Thomas with new interest. The other warriors began murmuring among themselves, clearly intrigued by this unexpected development. "You would marry my daughter?" Standing Bear asked slowly. "I would be honored to marry her," Thomas replied, looking directly at Ayana. "If she will have me." Ayana's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said simply. "I will marry you, Thomas McKenna." Standing Bear was quiet for a long time, weighing the implications of this sudden turn of events. Finally, he dismounted from his horse and walked over to where Thomas and Ayana stood together. "You understand what you are proposing?" he asked Thomas. "Marriage to an Apache woman will make you an outsider among your own people. And if you ever mistreat her, you will answer to me personally." "I understand completely," Thomas replied. "And I give you my word that I will love and protect her for as long as I live." Standing Bear studied both their faces, perhaps seeing something there that convinced him of the sincerity of their feelings for each other. Slowly, a smile began to spread across his weathered features. "Then perhaps this old father has found a son-in-law after all," he said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "But there must be a proper ceremony, one that honors both our traditions." The wedding took place 3 days later, in the clearing beside Thomas's cabin. Standing Bear had returned with his wife and several other family members, while Thomas had invited the few white neighbors who lived within traveling distance. The ceremony blended Apache and Christian traditions, creating something new and meaningful that honored both cultures. Ayana wore a traditional Apache wedding dress that had belonged to her grandmother, decorated with intricate beadwork and symbols of fertility and protection. Thomas wore his best clothes, which were simple but clean, and he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had found his purpose in life. The vows they exchanged were spoken in both English and Apache, witnessed by families who had put aside their differences to celebrate the union of two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances. When it was over, Standing Bear formally welcomed Thomas into the tribe, while the white settlers who attended began to understand that their new neighbor was now part of something larger than himself. As winter settled over the mountains, Thomas and Ayana began their life together as husband and wife. The cabin that had been a refuge from the world became a place where two cultures met and blended, where old sorrows were healed by new joys, and where love proved stronger than the prejudices that divided their peoples. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayana asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "Giving up your solitude to marry a woman who brought trouble to your door?" Thomas smiled and pulled her closer. "You did not bring trouble. You brought life, and you reminded me that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible." "What things?" "Love," Thomas said simply. "Freedom. The right to choose your own path in life. These things are worth any risk." Ayana looked up at him with eyes that sparkled in the firelight. "My father was right about one thing. I did bring shame to our family by refusing Kuruk. And I am proud of that shame," she said with a smile, "because it led me to you." As the months passed, Thomas and Ayana's marriage became a bridge between the Apache community and the scattered white settlers in the region. Thomas's workshop became a place where both cultures could meet and trade, where differences could be discussed and understanding could grow. Ayana proved to be an excellent ambassador for her people, helping to dispel stereotypes while learning valuable skills that she could share with other Apache women. The lonely lumberjack who had once sought only isolation had discovered that the greatest adventure of all was opening his heart to someone who needed his strength. In freeing Ayana from her chains, he had freed himself from the prison of grief and solitude that had held him captive for 8 years. And Ayana, who had been willing to die rather than surrender her freedom, had found something even more precious than independence. She had found a partner who valued her strength, respected her choices, and loved her for exactly who she was. Together, they had created something that neither could have achieved alone, a life filled with purpose, love, and the kind of happiness that comes from fighting for what matters most.